Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to an episode of Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to paint up a band of Spire Tyrants for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar Warcry. Warcry is a skirmishing game that takes place in the realms of chaos, and as you can see in this photo, this is what your end result will look like for your Spire Tyrants. By following the tips and techniques and materials that we suggest, we can save you over $124.08 and bring these miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard. So that being said, let's go and talk about how to paint up your Spire Tyrants quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. Alright, so the first thing you gotta do, of course, is assemble your miniatures, and of course you can assemble your miniatures any way that you want to. However, I will not be using these Spire Tyrants as what they're intended for your games of Warcry. I'm in fact using these miniatures for a game called Mordheim, which is a tabletop skirmish battle game that takes place in the Warhammer Fantasy setting. In that setting, you have to play a warband called Pit Fighters, and so I'm going to use these miniatures to kind of reinforce an Iron Golems warband that I did earlier a long time ago when Warcry first came out. Those miniatures were perfect for playing Pit Fighters and Mordheim, so I'm going to take the remainder of this Spire Tyrants warband. I'm going to paint them up exactly the same way, so that way they can match up with the Iron Golems that we can use on the tabletop for Mordheim. Now the first thing I do, of course, is you got to prime your miniatures and as well as texture miniatures. Now for the texturing on the bases, I like to use a combination of wood glue and sand. All I do is I paint wood glue directly onto the bases where I want texturing. I dust it with some sand that I get from my backyard garden, and then I make a mixture of 50% water and a 50% wood glue, and I make it to a slurry and I apply it all over the texturing, let it dry, so that way the texturing doesn't flake off the bases. After I'm done, I spray paint the entire thing with Flestolian flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart. Priming is an important step because what it does, it creates a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. Unfortunately, if you were to take acrylic paint and put it directly onto bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction would cause the paint to rub off your miniature, which would absolutely ruin the finish of your paint job. So in order to avoid that, we use primer to do that. And of course, primer does have a large result on the vibrancy of the colors that you use. Traditionally speaking, the more brighter the color scheme you want to use, the lighter the primer. So in this case, since I'm doing an oil wash method at the end of it, that's going to darken down the value of the miniatures, I decided to prime these in white. So next thing I do now is work on the flesh tones on these miniatures. Now, if you'll notice in the background, I do have my Iron Golems warband in the background, and the reason why I have those miniatures there is so that way I have them as a field of reference, because I'm going to paint up my miniatures to kind of match their color scheme, because like I mentioned before, I'm going to use these guys for a Mordheim campaign. Now, my Iron Golems are completely pale flesh color. I use taupe gray by Anise Acrylic to paint those guys up, so I want to make these guys contrast with the rest of the warband to add a variety of skin tones. So for these Spire Tyrants, I paint them all exactly the same with Anita's Acrylic Moccasin Brown. You get this at your local Hobby Lobby. You just put two thin coats directly all over the exposed flesh on these miniatures. Now these guys are Spire Tyrants, so there is a lot of exposed flesh on these guys. These guys are dressed more like gladiators than they actually are warriors. So just find all the parts of the flesh that are exposed and just put two thin coats directly on it. You don't need to be particularly neat at this stage, because if you do make any mistakes, we're going to paint over them later on in order to bring out those details in later steps. So now that we're done doing the flesh tones, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. Now, dry brushing is an important step on miniature painting because what it does, it creates the illusion of depth on your miniature by creating highlights. The pigments of the paint actually adhere to the raised surface of the miniature while the darker color stays in the recesses, creating this illusion of three-dimensionality as well as depth. It also highlights your miniatures as well. So the highlighting color we're going to use for this one for our dry brush, we use Territorial Beige or Albro paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. You're just going to do a quick dry brushing directly on all the flesh that we did expose earlier to bring out those highlights. Things like the musculature of their body, the individual joints of their fingers or knuckles, their cheekbones, exactly like that. Now when it comes to dry brushing, you always want to start with a light dry brush first, because you can add successful layers of dry brushing on top of that to bring up to the level of brightness that you desire. And once you're done with that step, next thing we're going to work on is some more of the details, especially the leather goods. So the next step, we're going to address all the leather goods on these characters. We're talking about belts, straps, as well as boots, as well as bracelets. So these guys are dressed like gladiators, like I mentioned before. They have a lot of leather wrapping around their bodies, as well as a lot of leather straps and leather boots and cuffs and things of that nature. So we're going to look for all those leather goods, and when we find them, we're going to pick those out in two thin coats of Payment by Apple Paint. You can get your local Walmart. The reason why I like using this Payment paint is because it's actually not exactly true black. It is a extremely dark gray, but the nice thing about Payment paint though is there's a bit of a grit texture to it, so when you do dry brushing with it, it catches those highlights and makes it look absolutely amazing. It's one of my favorite paints to use when it comes to using black on my miniatures. So just put 2 thin layers of Payment paint, ready to move on to the next color. So now we're going to dry brush all the leather goods that we did earlier. We're going to just do a quick dry brushing using Pale Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart or Hobby Lobby. We're just going to do a quick dusting real fast of the dry brushing directly onto the leather, so that way we can catch the edges of the leather straps and the belts, as well as on the texturing and the folds of the fabric on their boots. And once we're done with that, we're ready to move on to our next detail. Now for this next photo, I do apologize. I made a mistake with this photo. I did not take pictures of me painting the Troll Slayer beard that's on the fighter in the center of the screen. I did forget to take the pictures for the dry paint coat, base coating, and the dry brushing, so I do apologize for that. Once again, I'm not a professional YouTuber, so I'm just a hobbyist, so I will make mistakes sometimes. So for the beard, all I use is ripe tomato. It's a color you see me use multiple times on my channel's cheap shot videos. I just put 2 thin coats of that ripe tomato directly onto the beard in order to get a good solid base coat for this guy, because I want to make him look like he's more like a rogue troll slayer that's joined up with this warband. And now that we have the base coat down for the Troll Slayer's beard, next we gotta do, of course, is dry brush. We're gonna dry brush some Tropic Orange by Apple Barrel paint as well, which you can get from your local Walmart. You guys have seen me use this product multiple times on my cheap shot videos. All you can do is do a dry brush real quick on the beard to bring out all the different locks, as well as the individual fibers of hair that's inside the Troll Slayer's beard. So now that we're done with that, we're gonna make up our next detail, which is on the grips as well as the cording and loincloths of these fighters. The next detail is going to be things like loincloths, as well as the cording, as well as the knots around their headdresses that these guys actually have as well. Now the color we're going to use for this one is Tahitian Blue by Delta Serum Coat. You can get it at your local Hobby Lobby. And the reason why we're using this color is because it's a nice light turquoise color that's going to contrast nicely with the rest of the color schemes that we're going to have going on in these miniatures. And the reason why is because we're using a lot of red as well as a lot of gold on these miniatures, because I want them to match the iron golems, as you can see in the background. So having that teal color is going to nice contrast with all the reds and browns as well as golds these characters have. It's going to be a really eye-catching detail as well. And so you just put 2 thin coats of this directly onto things like the grips of the weapons, for example, the loincloths they're wearing, the top knots, etc. So the next major detail we're going to paint on these guys is on the armor. Now if you'll notice, I painted all the armor in solid gold, and the reason why that's the case is because there's a lot of scroll work and filigree directly onto the armor, like the shoulders as well as the chest plates, the shield these characters are carrying. There's a lot of gold details we're going to be doing in order to do that. Now the problem what you do with this, of course, is that it's very difficult to paint. So what we're going to do is we're going to paint the entire thing gold, and then we're going to fill out the color of the flat spaces between the scroll work on the armor with red. We're going to use that doing glazing in order to do that. And the reason why is because when you paint glazing like red color directly over a metallic color, it kind of creates this kind of shimmering colored metal alloy look on the armor. I did this with my iron golems way long ago when I first started painting up my Warcry warbands, so this is going to look really nice. So the color we use for this one is called Emperor's Gold. It's very similar to Retributor armor, but it's significantly cheaper. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 99 cents, and we're going to paint directly 2 thin layers of this directly on all the gold armor that these characters are wearing. So things like the pauldrons, the chest plates, any kind of shielding they might have on the shields, the helmets, any kind of jewelry they're carrying as well. We paint those in 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, and they're ready to move on to our glazing. And as you can see in this photo, this is the dramatic change that we see in the armor when we do glazing. As you can see, it has like this metallic red color going on with the armor, and we achieve this by doing glazing. Now, what you're going to do is you're going to use Anita's Acrylics True Red, and what you're going to do is you're going to mix this with water. You're going to make it to almost like a 50-50 mixture, and you can make sure that the red paint is thin as ink, basically. And the reason why is because what you're going to do is you're going to apply this on successive layers directly onto the armor panels and the negative spaces on the armor to bring out those red details. Now what this does, of course, the water makes the red very translucent, so when you put this on like a wash, what ends up happening is that gold kind of bleeds through a little bit through the red, and it gives it that kind of metallic shimmering red look. And at the same time, it's very eye-catching and contrasts quite nice with all the gold elements that we did. Now there is a problem with glazing. Glazing takes a very long time to do. It's a time-consuming process, and it's also quite boring because you have to wait for this stuff to completely dry before you add the next layer of glazing on top of that. So my suggestion to you is to use this as maybe an entire painting session time to do this, because you want to be careful, you want to be kind to yourself, and you want to be patient, which is kind of a pain, but you know, to achieve this result, that's exactly what you got to do. So you're going to put 3 to 4 layers of this glazing directly onto your miniatures, and when it's done, you get this beautiful translucent metallic effect on your miniature. Now if you do make any mistakes or some of the red does kind of appear up on the gold, that's perfectly fine. All you got to go is go back with your Deco's Arts Emperor's Gold and just kind of neaten it up a little bit and make those edges kind of clear. As you can see here, it looks a beautiful dramatic result, and it contrasts nicely with all the turquoise as well as the earth tones we have for the skin. So with most of the miniatures fully completed, we can now start working on the finer details. And the first thing we're going to do is on the bone elements on these miniatures. So a lot of these guys have things like horns, they have teeth being exposed, they have bits of bone tied directly into their armor. So any part that we think is bone in that material, we're going to use 2 thin layers of light mocha by apple barrel paint. We're just going to put 2 thin solid coats on that. We're not even going to highlight it, and the reason why is because when we oil wash it, that oil wash is going to do a beautiful job staining those bone elements and bring a lot of those details out. Now another thing we got to work on is some of the masonry that the leader is standing on. As you can see, the guy is standing on a piece of block. So in order to bring out that detail and to make it contrast nicely with the rest of the miniature, I'm going to paint that 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal by apple barrel paint to get a good, nice, solid base coat on that ruined piece of masonry. And on that same piece of masonry, I'm going to dry brush it real quick with some Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a nice pale pale turquoise color. As you can see, it brings a lot of the texturing on that piece of masonry that the character is standing on as well. And the reason why I picked that is because that masonry will then kind of contrast with the brownish grayish color they're going to put on the texturing on the bases, because you want to add some color variety to make it visually appealing. And one of the last few details we're going to work on real quick is on the actual steel elements of these miniatures as well. So that's the very last metallic element we're going to focus on, which are the blades of the weapons. So like the blades of the axes, the swords these characters are carrying, chainmail that's laying out for their armor as well. So any part that you want to have that detail painted silver, just going to put 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a beautiful dark metallic gray color. We're going to put this directly on all the silver elements on these miniatures. And as weird as it may sound, we're actually fully completed with all the additional painting on these miniatures, and now that we're done with that, we're going to move on to an oil wash. So we're going to wash our miniatures only once, or we're going to use an oil wash in order to do that. Now for this step, when it comes to a quick paint method like this where you only use 1 wash to paint your miniatures, a lot of people like to use Army Painted Strong Tone in order to achieve this result, which is perfectly fine because Army Painted Strong Tone is a beautiful product that's exactly as advertised. The only problem though is it costs about $37 a can, so if you're running into situations where money is a bit of an issue to paint up your miniatures that way, may I suggest using Midwax Poly Shades and Mission Oak. And the reason why I want to use that was because it achieves exactly the same results as Army Painted Strong Tone, but only costs $6.99 at your local Walmart. So it's a fraction of the cost and achieves very similar results. And that's exactly what I did with these miniatures as well. I took that Midwax polyacrylic and I just painted the entirety of the miniature and let it sit and rest. Now the oil washing does a couple of things. The first thing that it does, of course, is it seeps directly into the recesses of the miniatures and brings out a lot of the details we couldn't see earlier. Things like gaps in the armor panel. It also does a really good job of actually separating our colors between our gold as well as the red elements of our armor. It seeps into the primary crevices like the musculature, the folds of the fabric, the links of the chainmail, etc. The second thing that it also does as well is that it smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing. If you'll notice, the chalky appearance that we had earlier from our dry brushing has been smoothed out by that oil wash. And the third thing the oil wash also does as well is it mutes down the vibrancy of the colors that we use and makes them quite dark. And that's the reason why we use such bright colors in the earlier phases of the painting program, so that way you can match that look. Now, typically speaking, I do like to do an oil wash on my bases as well as my miniatures, but I did not do it this time around. The reason why is because you look in the background there, my iron golems, I did not put oil wash on their bases when I first painted them up, so I wanted to maintain that same cohesive look between these guys as well as my iron golems, so I just did the oil wash on the miniatures themselves. Now, I will admit this, you will have to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure because there is polyurethane mixed in with the stain, just like it is for Army Painted Strong Tone. So my suggestion is to use this as the very last step of your painting process of whenever you paint. Wait 24 hours later and come back to it and start working on it again. If you start handling this stuff while it's still tacky and wet, you could ruin the finish of your miniatures, which of course would destroy all the work that you did up to this point. So just trust the process, let them sit and dry, and once they're cured, you can move on. Alright, so this has been 24 hours later, so now we're going to start working on the bases of these miniatures. I'm going to paint them up my typical Chaos Wasteland paint scheme when it comes to my bases, so that way they match up with my iron golems in the background. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put 2 thin layers of pigment paint directly on top of the entirety of the texturing of the bases that we did earlier. Now, if you'll notice, there is some like white that's peeking through the base coating. If that happens, it's no big deal because we're going to dry brush that stuff anyways, so it's going to look like it's part of the paint job. Now, the next color we're going to use in order to dry brush our bases, we're going to use some burnt sienna by Folk Art. We're just going to put a nice dusting of this stuff directly all over the black bases that we did earlier. It kind of creates this kind of burnt out, kind of wasteland kind of look that I imagine that the Chaos Wastelands look like. We're just going to do a quick dry brushing of that. We're going to move on to our next dry brushing color. And the very last color we're going to use to dry brush the bases, of course, is Pale Gray by Folk Art. We're just going to put this directly on top of all the colors that we did earlier on the bases to kind of create this kind of ashy, burnt out wasteland look that these guys are walking on. At the same time, it also matches very nicely with the iron golems that we have in the background. And the very last detail we're going to do real quick is we're going to rim the bases in 2 thin layers of burnt sienna by Folk Art. Once again, you get this at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. We're just going to put 2 thin layers directly on the round rims of the bases to kind of match not only that kind of wasteland look on their bases, but to also match the bases of the iron golems that we did in the background. Now for the very last step, which is a completely optional, of course, is just use spray varnish directly onto our miniatures to give it more of a matte finish. The only problem when you do oil washing is that it does have a high gloss finish. So in order to cure that, we're just going to take some Cryolan Matte Spray that you get at my local Walmart. I was going to spray them once over and give it a little bit more of a matte finish, and that pretty much finishes up our miniatures. Now obviously, if you don't like that look, you like that high gloss finish, you can obviously skip this step. So here you guys go. Here is the end result of our miniatures. As you can see, we brought these guys up to a beautiful tabletop standard, and assuming that you're purchasing everything from our cheapskate method for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $25.67 on our paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the cheaper craft paints from Walmart and Hobby Lobby instead. So now that we're done showing you our cheapskate method how to paint these guys up, let's talk about the materials you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact results we did by using those name brand paints instead. So if you want to achieve the exact same results we did but using the Army Painter as well as Citadel materials instead, these are the materials that you need to buy in order to achieve the exact same results. You'll need to buy a can of Corax White Spray for $17 as well as the colors Thunderhawk Blue, Baneblade Brown, Luganeth Orange, Baylor Brown, Eshin Gray, Trollslayer Orange, Baharoth Blue, Mephiston Red, XV88, Doombull Brown, Oathorn Gray, and all those colors would cost you $4.55 a piece. After that, for the texture, you need to buy a pot of Astro Granite, which is going to cost you $7.80. You also need to buy the colors Lead Belcher, Aethermatic Blue, and Retributor Armor. All those colors cost you $7.80 for those colors. You also need to buy a can of Imperial Strong Tone, which would cost you $37 for that, as well as a can of Munitorian Varnish for $19.50. So assuming that you're purchasing everything from Citadel as well as Army Painter for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $149.75 to paint up your miniatures the same way we did, but using the name brand paints instead. When you subtract that from our cheapskate total of $25.67, you end up with a grand total savings of $124.08. So there you guys have it. If you're looking for a way to save money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you achieve very similar results with a fraction of the cost, and that's money that you could use for other things like buying more miniatures or saving it or doing whatever the heck you want to do with it. It's your money. your choice. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can paint up your Spire towers to a beautiful tabletop standard. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always. Also, catch us on the next video next week. I'll catch you guys later. Peace out and stay classy.